Okay, let's get started. So, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Anatomy of a Toy, Impact, Innovation, Best Practice and Child Rights. We're pleased to be joined by over 100 registered attendees from across Europe, North America and Asia today. So a really warm welcome wherever you're joining us from, and yeah, thanks for making time to spend time with us on the webinar today. The issue of child rights continues to move up the business and human rights agenda. And as we'll soon hear today, global norms and standards, including the Children's Rights and Business Principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and also the Sustainable Development Goals, are each calling on businesses everywhere to respect and support children's rights across their entire operations, and that's including the workplace, marketplace, and of course across their supply chains. And from toy safety to responsible marketing, supporting family workplaces to protecting young workers, the toy industry really is uniquely positioned to protect and support the rights and well-being of children through the proper design, advertising, sale and manufacture of toys. So today's webinar really is an opportunity to find out more about the children's rights and business principles and the relevant risks and opportunities they pose for the global toy industry. On today's webinar, we're going to be looking at that issue, and really this webinar is actually the first in a series that the Ethical Toy Programme is hosting in partnership with Save the Children. And through this partnership, we're going to be offering our members positive support on child rights issues by bringing you access to latest thinking and learning, as well as sharing innovation and best practice case studies. So we're really excited about this partnership, which is really going to provide us opportunities to share learnings and best practice and innovation to really equip you with additional knowledge and understanding on child rights and business issues. We're also partnering with Save the Children, though, to further scale our Left Behind Children programs. And with the support of toy brands and retailers, these programs are already supporting thousands of domestic migrant workers with left behind children and supporting family workplaces. So we're really excited about the dissemination aspect of our partnership, but also excited to really partner with Save the Children to start to push even further on worker wellbeing. But back to today's webinar, and we're going to be introducing the child rights and business principles in detail. We'll then move on to explore some of the associated supply chain risks and look at what good practice remediation looks like to address those risks. And then we'll be looking through programs and best practice initiatives already underway to support child rights in the toy supply chain. As I said, that's the focus for today, but you can expect to hear a lot more from us over the coming months as we plan future webinars exploring different aspects of the child rights and business agenda or issues the toy industry. I'm Mark Robertson, Senior Vice President of the Ethical Toy Programme, and I'm joined today by a really good panel of expert speakers who are on today's webinar. First up, we're going to hear from Mateus Forsberg, who's Senior Advisor, Child Rights and Business at Save the Children Centre for Child Rights and Business. Mateus is going to start us off with an overview of the child rights and business principles, and he'll also discuss the issues for the toy industry, which are relevant for all aspects of business activities in the toy industry. We're also joined today by Ellen Schliebitz, who's Director of Communications at the Centre for Child Rights and Corporate Social Responsibility, that you may also know as CCR CSR. And Ellen is going to focus on child rights risks and remediation supply chains, and she'll also focus on some of the key sourcing countries, so including China and Vietnam, in discussing those risk issues. Ellen's also going to briefly explore the links between child rights and other issues as well in her presentation. I should point out that Ellen is joining us from a fairly remote location in northwest China, and Mateus is joining us from Hanoi in Vietnam. So bear with us if we have any lag in connection time, but I think we should be okay. Finally, I'm going to share some innovation and best practices from our work at the Ethical Toy Programme that we're doing to support child rights, empower women, and really promote family-friendly toy factory environments across the supply chain. We aim to speak for around 45 minutes today, and then we're going to leave time at the end for questions. Your microphones are all muted, but you can submit a question at any point during our presentations, and basically you do that using the text box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll then answer the questions at the end of the presentation during the Q&A section. Finally, today's session is being recorded with recordings made available to you at the end of the session, so you can share those with a colleague, or if you want to listen again, then you can do. Okay, so getting started then. So we want to start off really with a poll just to kind of quickly gauge your, to understand really how you prioritize child rights and issues in your own businesses at the moment. So hopefully on screen in a moment, you should see the following question. And really, we just want you to think about which aspects of the child rights and business principles you feel are most relevant to your business. So we'll launch the poll now. Hopefully, votes will start coming in now. I think I'm seeing some kind of results come in. Okay, interesting. We'll just give it another minute. Okay. Still a few of you voting. Okay, we'll close it there. And the final results are, there with a second. Interesting. So it looks like, so obviously, perhaps not surprisingly, child labour, eliminating child labour across all business activities is obviously a key area where your key area of relevance that we identified. But it's actually good to see really a cross section of responses across all of the different components of the poll. So interesting that a good percentage of you are obviously focusing on product safety and security from a child rights lens, but also the decent work agenda, which is of course really important to the broader issue of child rights and business principles in particular. So we'll bear all of that in mind as we move through today's webinar, but thanks for sharing those insights as well. It's good that nobody has said they don't feel child rights are relevant to their company. That's heartening. But thanks for your insights, and we'll, as I said, we'll take those into account as we work through today. So with that, I will now hand you over to our first speaker, which is Mateus Forsberg from Save the Children. So Mateus, over to you. Mateus, do we have you online?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay,
yes. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And in the interest of time, let's move directly to why this agenda is important and why we are doing this as a child rights organization. And we can then see these are just some sort of snapshot figures on the situation for children in the world. And we can see that there are about 1 billion children that are deprived of their basic rights in one way or another. And this means really essential rights for survival and development, be it education, nutrition, survival and protection, etc. We also see that there is still about 150 million children in child labor, almost half of which are in hazardous work. And the key message here is that these figures are far behind the targets that we have set globally together, all different actors, including governments also, in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are on this specific agenda working with companies and the private sector because we know and are convinced that a business can really make a huge difference. So moving on, the Sustainable Development Goals really calls on all of us to work together. And it calls for business to both respect and support human rights, including children's rights. And in line with this, we also require, but also see a trend going from traditional philanthropy isolated to more integrating sustainability in the business itself. And this includes child rights. The key aspect here is that our respective expertise and our joint expertise must meet in relation to children's rights, which includes also indirect impact through parents and their working conditions and youth, etc. We know what the situation is, but we don't know, we are not business experts. So businesses really need to provide their expertise, and we provide ours. And when that meets, we can find solutions and ways forward. And to lay a platform for this, the Children's Rights and Business Principles were developed already back in 2012. And since then, there's been a lot of practical work with companies in many, many different ways, but also advocacy towards governments and other actors in society, not least our own colleagues globally. We are present in more than 120 countries. So to get them to understand business impact has had a great impact also in our ability to globally work with business to find solutions. The beauty of this platform, principles are air until you start filling them with something. But this is what the journey we have been on since 2012, and even earlier in the sense of our regional center, which Ellen represents, and you will hear more of that later. But the beauty of this is that it really covers from A to Z from a business perspective, and is in one way or another relevant for every single company. The first principle at the middle there, at the core, is integrating child rights. And this follows exactly the same systematic approach and long-term systematic approach as the business and human rights framework and other sustainability frameworks, and indeed also business development itself, to make a commitment and then do your proper due diligence, take action, and then see and be ready to remediate whatever happens along the way that you did not foresee. But then the principles also cover three main parts: the workplace, which includes child labor, but it also includes young workers, parents and caregivers, not only in the supply chain, but also in stores, in offices, etc., often forgotten. And the supply chain perspective we will hear more about from CCR CSR, our regional center here. It also covers the marketplace, which is of huge importance for the toy industry, not only in terms of the products being safe for children, but also if they promote a creative play. And if they are brings a positive play to children, and not least also marketing and advertising. The signals that the toy industry globally sends to the next generation in terms of gender roles, in terms of ethnicity, etc., is enormously important for our global development. And then it also covers the community and environment. Some of these principles are more relevant for some sectors than others, but it includes also things like promoting government efforts on working rights and decent work, etc. And not counteracting. It includes things like tax contribution, etc. But this, just taking this as a platform, as a company, enables a holistic approach. So if we move on to the next slide, the due diligence is key, and looking through all parts of a company. And this can be done also in parallel with also working on specific already identified wishes from companies or identified challenges already for the industry as such, which Ellen will elaborate later. But it is important because it enables companies through our collaboration to make informed decisions on what are priorities in different parts of the business and what are practicable and doable next steps, including what are must-dos and what are want-to-dos and what are wish-to-dos. So it enables companies to know and make informed decisions. So moving on, to advance business impact on child rights in the framework of global development for the benefit of children does not only include working directly with companies themselves, it includes also building capacity among local civil society around the world, which we do, on how business impacts children. It includes also advocating governments on legislation and regulation and procurement, etc., both globally, regionally, and nationally, and includes also engaging with the private sector from an organizational point of view. Our partnership with the Ethical Toy Program is an excellent example of that. We also work with the cocoa sector, with the textile sector in different ways. And then finally, we do work and put a lot of emphasis on working directly with individual companies, and that's not only to make a real difference and to be the most relevant to each company, because each company looks different, even if they are in the same sector, but also so that we as an organization learn what is doable, what is viable, and what works, and most of all, what makes a difference for children. And the last slide here is some examples of companies we have worked with on child rights and business principles specifically. We have many more, obviously, that we are partners with for child rights in general, but these are some examples of companies who have also approved that we communicate this. Of companies we have worked with on child rights and business. Some of them really taking the holistic approach from a headquarters perspective and then step by step. Some of them starting with a specific supply chain challenge or a specific marketing challenge, and so on. So with that, I say thank you for now, and look forward to any questions that may come later. So back to you, Mark.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mateus. I think that was a really useful top-level overview of the child rights and business principles, and kind of just setting out how they, their relevance for companies, certainly in our sector, in the toy sector. So in a second, I'm going to pass over to Ellen from CCR CSR. But before that, we have another quick poll that we're going to run. And really, this poll is just to find out where you're at, or how confident, I should say, you are in integrating child rights into your responsible sourcing strategy. So we're going to launch that poll now. And if you follow the same instructions as last time, if you kind of vote now, then we can see what the poll tells us. Okay, just give it another few seconds. Okay, I think we'll end it there. I think the numbers are settling. So if we close the poll. Okay, good. So we see then that almost half of you are quite confident in your integration of child rights into responsible sourcing strategy, which is good to hear. And 27% of you are very confident, which is also good to hear. I think that's probably reflective of the kind of variety of companies we have, toy companies and brands and retailers we have on today's call. So, but good, a good cross section of responses there. And interestingly, that nearly, well, just under 30% of you are just starting out. So hopefully today's webinar will help you with insights to strengthen your knowledge in that regard. And obviously, the Ethical Toy Program is certainly available as a resource to help you move further on child rights, particularly in supply chains. Great. Okay, so We'll now move on to pass over to Ellen from CCR CSR, who's going to take a deeper dive into some of those child responsible sourcing risks in supply chains. Ellen, over to you. I think we just need to wait for a second for Ellen to be unmuted.
Hi, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Ellen.
Hi, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. So to begin, maybe there are some of you out there who don't know who CCR CSR is or what we do. So I'll just begin with a brief introduction. We are a social enterprise and we work directly with international brands in their supply chains to improve their direct and indirect impact on children, and through that strengthening their sustainable business. Now, we consider ourselves pioneers in the field of child rights in business. We've been around for about a decade, and as far as we know, we're the only centre in the world that focuses exclusively on child rights and business. And we also consider ourselves enablers of change in areas that that governments or NGOs may find difficult to access. So in terms of where we work, we are currently headquartered in Hong Kong, but we're spread across 9 countries, and that list is growing every year, which is good. As you can see, our services include child labour prevention and remediation, but we also focus very heavily on supporting juvenile and young workers, and of course, migrant parent workers and their children. So today, I'm going to focus on 3 major or key issues that companies struggle with in their supply chains. And the first one is migrant parent workers. So Mark is going to be speaking a little bit more in depth about the FamilyFriendly Spaces program and migrant parent training program that we've been doing together over the past number of years. So I won't go into that in too much depth, and I'll leave that up to Mark. But I will focus more on on child labour and the risk of having children in production areas, as well as on young workers and what can be done to support them. So moving on to the first issue, which is migrant parent workers. In China, domestic migration has a major impact on children. About 247 million migrant workers have left home to work, and they have left 61 million children approximately behind. And now this has a significant impact on the relationship between the parents and their children. Obviously, it results in estrangement, strained relations, but also it has a knock-on effect on their attitude and performance at work. In 2017, we did a comprehensive study on migrant parent workers in China, and we actually found that 18% of migrant parent workers brought their children with them from the hometowns directly to the production floor during the school breaks. And this is because a lot of the parent workers don't have any childcare options, especially during the summer when schools close for pretty long periods of time. And that's obviously posing major compliance risks, and it's also putting the children in direct risk too. The same study found that 44% of parents don't know their children well, and that workers are less likely to stay at the factory long term when they believe that their work negatively influences their relationship with their children. Another surprising finding of this study is that the children who migrated with their parents to their place of work were actually at greater risk of neglect. We found that these children spent about 23 hours a week unattended versus 4 hours among left behind children. And the reason for that is that the parents were often working long hours or had to do overtime, and there was nobody around to look after their children. So rather than focusing on the best practices for migrant parent workers, I'm going to leave that up to Mark to talk about. That includes family-friendly spaces and migrant parent training. So I'm going to move directly on to some of the driving factors of child labour in the supply chain. So this is just a general overview and some general observations. Many children are growing up without their parents, as I just mentioned, and they're left in the care of extended family. And these children are at greater risk of exploitation. And they're also at greater risk of dropping out of school early to become child labourers. Another issue is that there are insufficient public services for migrant children, and that leaves them unprotected. And another issue is that the education systems in many countries are just not equipped to cater to individuals. So we did a study in 2016 on auditors' insights on child labour, and we found that in China, the main reason for children to work was actually a lack of interest in school. Now, in other regions in Asia, such as Bangladesh or Myanmar, poverty is obviously a much bigger factor and difficulties paying school fees. And then finally, a major issue is a weak age verification practices and a very low awareness about the risks of hiring underage workers. And this is particularly the case in lower tiers. So today I'm just going to give you a bit of a snapshot overview of some trends that we've seen last year in terms of child labour. Just again, a very general overview. Last year, 81 cases of child labour were referred to us, which is probably the highest number of child labour cases referred to us to date. I will stress, though, that I don't think that really means that there's been an increase in child labour all of a sudden in 2018. I just think that the clients that we work with are getting better at identifying and reporting these child labour cases to us in a timely manner. But what was of interest about these cases is that 70% of the children were 15 years of age, 21% were 14, and 10% were 12 and 13 years old. Another interesting find was that 45% of those cases were reported to us during the summer months when schools were closed. And this is again directly linked to the migrant parent issue, in that many of these parents just simply had no place to keep their children, so they opted to bring them with them to the factory floor. So some of these children weren't officially working in the factories, they were just accompanying their parents, but they happened to be there when an auditor visited and were labelled as child labour. And then in terms of how the child labourers actually ended up in the factories, 30% of them used fake IDs, and another 30% were hired through labour agents. So that is just hopefully a little bit of food for thought for you. To give you a brief overview of what a best response to child labour remediation case could look like and some important factors to consider, I think mainly immediate action is crucial. In our experience, the longer you wait, the more likely the child is to disappear and to end up working in another factory. So when an auditor spots a child labour, a child under the legal minimum working age, it's important to immediately raise the alarm bell and to initiate a rapid assessment, and then from that to create a child labour remediation programme. And when we work with on child labour remediation programmes, the most important thing is keeping the best interest of the child in the centre. That is always the number one focus. Also, it's not enough to just simply carry out a child labour remediation programme. It's crucial to understand the root causes and then to address those systematic risks so that it doesn't happen again. Paying a fair living stipend is also crucial. This is really one of the main factors that ensures that these children are on track, stay on track with the remediation programme, and that they don't end up looking for a job in another factory. Now, when we do these child labour remediation programs, we of course encourage the children to go back to education or to sign up to a vocational training course. We ask them what their interests are, what they would like to learn, or what they aspire to be in the future. But we never force anything onto a child. And as we say, we always make sure that no matter what situation they're in, they will receive a fair living stipend that can get them through the time until they reach the legal working age. And then another thing to consider is just implementing a youth development program and supporting parent workers and using that as a child labour prevention mechanism. So family-friendly spaces, as we will hear, is definitely one such mechanism. So moving on to young workers. So among the challenges that young workers are facing, one is that we're seeing high numbers of school dropouts, and they are lacking the opportunities to access decent work. Often they find themselves in jobs with no career development or skill building opportunities. And one factor playing into that is the fact that there is hiring discrimination going on, especially in Tier 1 factories. Many of these factories, they have strict hiring policies. They don't want to hire anyone under the age of 18. So that means those who are between the minimum legal working age and 18 are unable to access these jobs, and they're being pushed down further into the supply chain to look for work. And that leads into the next challenge, which is lack of protection, because they're in the deeper supply chain, they are more likely to face exploitation, labor laws and international standards are less likely to be adhered to. But the positive thing is that this can all be turned around. There's really great things that you can do to support young workers and also to improve your own business. And one is by providing skill building opportunities and access to decent work to the young workers so that they can become skilled workers and contribute to the workforce in your supply chains. It can also help to address labor shortages and, as I said, develop a stable workforce. And you can train staff and suppliers on best practices in young worker management, which will then reduce compliance risks. So next up, to show you some of the more practical programs in terms of supporting young workers. One is a young worker training. This is one that CCR CSR has been rolling out for a number of years. What it does is it helps young workers transition into the workplace. Many of them are away from home for the first time. They are vulnerable, inexperienced. So this training really gives them a boost in confidence, in communication skills. It helps them build resilience, helps them deal with conflicts at the workplace, and to develop an all-around positive attitude towards work and life. And then in terms of impact, we've seen that this program has helped them understand their strengths and weaknesses well, and it's also helped them feel more able to handle disagreements and conflicts with their co-workers. So this is feedback from 436 young workers that took part in 13 young worker training sessions. Next up, another best practice is this youth development program. Last year, we implemented one in Vietnam, and we're currently rolling out a similar one in Indonesia. And how this program worked is that young workers, usually from marginalized backgrounds, just school dropouts, they were hired by factories. These factories committed to giving them a stable job, a stable income over a 6-month period, and to give them regular training opportunities. So that was training, technical training, but also training in soft skills and life skills such as communications, IT, financial literacy, and so on. And then the goal at the end was to have so basically for these young workers to gain a wide range of skills and experience, and then to have the option to continue working on in these factories. And at the same time, the program also trained the managers and the supervisors to be in a better position to manage young workers effectively and to identify suitable tasks and job stations for them. So last year in total, 88 young people were hired in 5 factories in Vietnam. 86 managers learned how to manage the young workers. The young workers received a total of 80 hours of technical and soft skills training. And in terms of impact, there was a 36% increase in the number of young workers planning to stay on in the factory for 2 years or more. And in general, we found that these workers were working less hours. They were working under 40 hours per week because previously, many of them had worked in very exploitative jobs that required excessive hours and overtime. So with this program, they were, guaranteed less than 40 hours per week, and they were very satisfied with their salaries and they felt safe. So that is just one example of how young workers can be supported. So moving on, I've prepared just kind of a snapshot data with some data of some child rights related issues in 4 different countries: China, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, because these are some of the major toy producing countries. And hopefully, these are just general, but hopefully they can give a little bit of an insight into what some of the major issues are and how that kind of compares between country. So in China, as I've already mentioned, migration is a major issue. There's 61 million left behind children and 247 million domestic migrants. In terms of education, education. According to the 2010 census, 76% of China's labor force had not attended high school. In terms of child labor, there are no official statistics for China, but we did do this study in 2016 on auditors' insights on child labor, and we found that auditors in China, 64% of auditors surveyed suspected child labor in China, and 82% of those cases were corroborated. So while it's not 100% representational of the entire situation in China, it does kind of provide an insight that child labor is still very much an issue. And then finally, young workers and student workers are not receiving protection and skill building opportunities. So those are a few of the general issues. Moving on to Vietnam. In Vietnam, we did an assessment of child rights in 4 factories in Vietnam to get an understanding of what the issues were there. And we found that migration is and left behind children is an issue there as well, but not to the same extent as in China. But that said, 20% of those that we had interviewed had children left behind. Also, 1 in 10 children aged 5 to 17 are estimated to be in child labor, and forced labor is also an issue. In terms of education, only 55% of Vietnam's youth complete their upper secondary education. And then according to this assessment that I just referred to, the biggest challenge that parent workers identified was looking after children and lacking maternity protection. And for young workers, we're seeing that there is discrimination in the labor market, and that most first-year factories are not hiring under 18s, which, as I mentioned, puts them in a precarious situation where they are forced to look for jobs in the informal sector or further down the supply chain. Moving on to Malaysia. In Malaysia, you have about 6 million foreign migrant workers, and about 50% of those are legal. And then in terms of education, 3% of the population doesn't finish secondary school and 1% don't finish primary school. So in Malaysia, the school dropout rate is not quite as bad as in China and Vietnam. But there you also have the issue of young girls. Many of them are foreign or migrant workers. They are not prepared for the workplace. Many topics are taboo, which means they have not been educated. It leads to unwanted pregnancies and sexual violence. And then finally, about 451,900 children in Malaysia have no documentation whatsoever, and that limits their access to education, and it really puts them at risk of exploitation. Finally, Indonesia. There are 2.4 million children estimated to be working, or 3.7 of all children aged 10 to 14, and many of these children are engaging in the worst forms of child labor. In terms of education, approximately 4.5 million Indonesian children who should be in school are not. 1 in 5 youth are unemployed in Indonesia, and those who are finding jobs work in the informal sector. And once again, hiring discrimination is also an issue among young workers in Indonesia. Okay, so finally, this is the last slide, and it basically summarizes some of the key points that I've touched on today. But I hope it also shows that child rights is more, it's more than just merely encompassing children. As I mentioned, it includes parent workers who need to be supported, and that can be done through childcare, through setting up factory-based family-friendly spaces or providing parenting training. It includes supporting young workers and protecting them, and that can be done through strengthening child labor prevention mechanisms by offering youth protection and youth development programs. And one thing I haven't really touched on, but which is very relevant, is that child rights can also be linked to other issues, including women's empowerment. Because one thing is these issues affect mothers, working mothers. By opening family-friendly spaces, for example, you're allowing mothers to spend time with their children. In China, it's very often the case that these women only get to see their children for a few days a year, but through these family-friendly spaces, they're spending the whole summer with them. And that also means that they're not quitting their jobs, because this is something that we see a lot, is that these women are forced to leave their jobs over the summer to look after their children. because of the fact that they can stay on their jobs, they're also gaining, able to hold on to greater financial independence. So these are all kind of things that tie into other issues. And also, as Mateus mentioned, these are also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So I am going to leave it at that for now, but I will stay on and I will be there to answer any questions that you have. So I will now hand over the mic back to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Ellen. And I can see we're getting some really interesting questions. Just a reminder to all of you, you can still submit these to us using the text box on your right-hand side of the screen. So do send those through and we'll get to them in just a short moment. Okay, so the final section of the webinar is back to me. I'm going to briefly explain more about the Ethical Toy Program worker wellbeing programs we're running, and also how we look at child rights from a kind of program perspective as well at the certification side. Very quick introduction to us, in case you don't know us. Essentially, we're the world's leading responsible sourcing program for the global toy, play and entertainment industry. Our focus is on improving and protecting the rights and well-being of workers at toy factories. And really we do this through audits, assessments, certification, training and capability building programs, and of course worker well-being programs which support the well-being of workers at toy factories globally. Okay, so if we move on, just a bit more information, our program numbers. You can see that we work with around about 1,000 brands and retailers, and cover over 1,000 factories globally. And that's just a section of some of the members that we work with in partnership in the toy industry and retail sector as well. Okay, so focusing then on our work around child rights and business. So really, there's two components to our work to support child rights and integrate them into the toy industry supply chain. The first element that really is work that we do through our audit certification and, if you like, the training elements of our program. So back last year, we undertook a comprehensive update to our audit and certification program. But through that, we also took the opportunity to update elements of the audit checklist to ensure that they support family-friendly work environments of factories, enhance women's empowerment, but also add extra protections for young and vulnerable workers. So just this isn't a comprehensive list, but just to give you a flavour of how our criteria are supporting child rights issues. We've introduced criteria covering all forms of discrimination, particularly gender, but other kind of areas too. We also require additional requirements to ensure that job assignments and breaks are provided for workers who are pregnant or breastfeeding, so protections for women who in the workplace who are pregnant, of course, or after pregnancy who are in the workplace and need to breastfeed, etc. We've placed a greater emphasis on protections for younger workers. So they will include things like ensuring that young workers receive job roles which are appropriate for them and don't put them at risk. We define a young worker as, of course, a worker that's above the minimum wage but below the age of adulthood, which is typically 18 years of age. So on the audit side, we're ensuring that our checklist is supporting child rights in business. But then moving across to the other element of our work is which focuses more on worker well-being and programs we're running. I think Ellen's already explained the issues that migrant workers face in China, but also other countries as well. As we said, 61 million workers live separate from their parents, from their children, I should say. And this is a reason for this has impacts in lots of ways. So obviously there's a well-being issue. So if workers are separated from their children, then that causes problem for the bonds they have with their children and impacts on the well-being of children and their parents quite significantly. But also it can be quite disruptive as a business risk issue as well. So we found that up to 31% of migrant workers, when surveyed, have said that they'd have to leave a job to take care of their children. So we see, there's quite detailed well-being risks, but certainly business impacts too. Just also a few insights very quickly on the toy industry. So as Alan mentioned earlier, the vast majority of toy factory workers are women, up to 61% in China and as many as 78% in Vietnam. So this is an issue that certainly impacts women as well in the workplace. So we've developed essentially 4 different worker wellbeing programs to support workers with left behind children and support and promote women's empowerment. The first of which is family-friendly spaces, which essentially are spaces which reunite migrant workers with their left behind children during the summer school holiday months. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. We also run after school centres, which essentially provide year-round childcare for support for workers with children, extending the family-friendly spaces beyond summer months. We also deliver migrant parents training as well, and that's all about equipping workers with the skills they need to form better links with relationships with their left behind children. And we have a women's empowerment program too that I'll talk through in a second. So just taking then a very quick deep dive into our family-friendly spaces program. So this program is all about reuniting migrant workers with their left behind children during the summer school holiday months in China, and strengthening parental bonds and really enabling workers and children to spend more time with one another. Family-friendly spaces create safe and secure daycare facilities at factories, and these are always located in safe locations which are separate from production areas and enable children of workers to play, access learning opportunities and develop social skills and really spend time with their parents. And the whole point of FFS is really addressing the urgent need to provide childcare to children when they are out of school during the summer months, and at a time when they're most vulnerable and left without adequate childcare. The next part of the program is migrant parents training. So these are sessions which are classroom-based sessions we deliver in factories that focus on strengthening parents' remote parenting skills. And really they support women and help migrant workers overcome some of the stress and challenges associated with being separated from their children. The sessions focus on areas such as increasing workers' sense of value as a parent, helping workers understand the needs of their children, recognizing signs of distress remotely, but also improving workers' ability to support and protect their children. So that's migrant parents training. In terms of the impacts that we're seeing from these programs, they've been really quite profound. So we started our family-friendly program, Spaces program, with a small-scale pilot at 2 factories in China. But this year, we'll expand the program to over 30 factories in China and broaden the other aspects of the program too. And what we're finding is that once we deliver these programs at factories, they're really proving to be self-sustaining, with factories going on to continue to run the programs themselves once they experience the positive benefits they bring for their business, but also for their workers. And some of the kind of measurable impacts we've seen today have been really quite impressive. So we're tracking a 46% increase in levels of employee satisfaction rates for those that participate in the programs. We've seen a 146% increase in employee management trust. So real benefits to the factory as well. We're also seeing we've seen a 43% increase in worker retention rates amongst the family-friendly spaces delivered to date. And also, quite excitingly, we saw a 117% increase in workers reporting that they feel more confident in educating their children from a distance, having participated in the migrant parents training. And the satisfaction rates amongst workers participating in the family-friendly spaces program is really high. I mean, as high as 99% when we survey workers on this. So we're seeing some really, really exciting impacts, and the worker wellbeing element of this of our program will be something that we continue to invest in year on year. Finally, just a very quick update on our women's empowerment work. So this program is focused in India, and essentially is work we're doing in partnership with BSR, really to look at new approaches to drive women's empowerment at toy factories. So working with BSR, we've developed core groups which comprise of factory owners, senior managers, line leaders, and HR staff at factories. Each of the factories participating in the pilot. And really what we're doing is delivering training, awareness and capability building to these core groups in factories around women's empowerment issues, to raise their awareness of women's empowerment risks, but also then to kind of equip them with the skills so they can cascade that knowledge and training to their co-workers and colleagues in the factories. So slightly different to the traditional train-the-trainer approaches, but all about cascading knowledge and learning. And again, we're seeing some really exciting impacts on the workers that have participated in these programs. So not only are women more empowered in the workplace, but we're also seeing other benefits, wider benefits, if you like, around child rights and women's empowerment issues. So women report being more able to engage their whole family and household chores, for example. Women feeling more empowered to be through their involvement in decision making, and also women treating their children more equally. So we're seeing a lot of exciting benefits that don't just focus on the factory level, if you like, but also deliver wider benefits, which of course are relevant to the child rights issues we've covered today, but are also relevant to other issues as we discovered on Ellen's presentation. Okay, so I think we're more or less at the next start, the kind of Q&A section of the webinar. Before I get there though, I'll just quickly cover off how we deliver these programs. So both our Left Behind Children program and our Women's Empowerment programs are delivered with the support and sponsorship of our brands and retailer partners that we work with. You can see some of those on screen now. At the end of today's webinar, we'll share a handout that will explain more about how these programs work, share more information about how we're working in partnership with toy brands and retailers to advance child rights and support women's empowerment, but also explain how these programs can work for you with details of how you can get involved and sponsor. So more information on its way on those programs, and obviously we'd be very excited to work with you on a sponsorship level and find out how we can support you by running these programs out at your factories. Okay, so I think we're now 10 minutes to the hour, so I think we'll now switch over to the Q&A section of the webinar. So we'll just give us a moment to bring Ellen and Mateus back into the conversation. We've had some good questions coming in, but actually, Mateus, I'm actually going to start with a question that's probably for you. Could you just briefly tell us a bit more about the, if you like, holistic child rights issues that companies should consider? So I know you covered some of these in your brief overview, but if you could just give us a bit more information on the kind of, if you like, the key issues that companies should be looking at from a child rights perspective.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid my response will have to be in a sense that the key issue is the holistic itself. We're not looking for a revolution overnight. We're not looking for companies to dramatically change a lot of things overnight and to be able to report zero issues overnight. It really is the long-term systematic approach that we want to engage with companies on, the due diligence approach. You have all heard the tremendous expertise that our friends and colleagues in our regional center, CCR CSR, through Ellen, has shared. And there is a lot to proven that can be done with proven results and solutions ready for the taken. We also have expertise in headquarters impact assessments, using the child rights and business principles as a platform, but then filling that with all core departments of the company. And that would also then include things like marketing, things like product safety and creative products, etc., as well as internal human resources and staff engagement. Now, for the toy industry, obviously being so closely related to children, there are many more issues that are critical. Stores, youth working in stores, how to approach children in stores, how to approach parents in stores, how things are placed and marketed. But in essence, what we can contribute to companies with, apart from the real expertise into the supply chain that Ellen highlighted so brilliantly, is also a systematic approach depending on what company you are, because this is toys and entertainment. So depending on what company you are, what impact do you have on the next generation in terms of their safety, in terms of their development, but also in terms of what values they will bring with them into adulthood. And that is where we can also be a collaborator, joining our expertise, as it were, working together.
Okay, thanks, Mateus. Another question here, which I'll quickly answer, and then I'll probably pass across to Ellen. What are the biggest child rights issues that the child rights issues that are most relevant to the toy industry? So, from our perspective, there's certain kind of characteristics, if you like, that apply to toy production. So, obviously, toy production is very seasonal. The pre-production takes place during the summer months in China, and that happens at a time when there are heightened childcare risk issues, as we discovered. So certainly that's a time when toy factories are certainly very busy, but we also work with them to support them through our Left Behind Children program, family-friendly spaces programs, etc., that we pointed out. We also do quite a lot of work around supporting young workers, as I touched on, but also student workers. So they're not children, but they are younger workers who can be vulnerable if works placements, etc., aren't properly carried out. So we do quite a lot of work to ensure that student workers and younger workers in toy factories are protected, again, during peak production months that we see. Of course, the issue of child rights is of particular relevance to the toy industry, and there's a real link up with the values, if you like, of the toy industry and the work that we do on programs. So, but really working with that link in mind, the reason we're really focusing on Left Behind Children as a challenge is not only because it's obviously an important worker wellbeing issue we want to tackle, but also because it's a very good fit with what the toy industry is all about, and indeed is working to address. So they're just a few issues I would raise from my side. But Ellen, over to you for thoughts from you.
Hi, Mark. So I think another issue as well is supply chain transparency, because in our experience, we have done some supply chain mapping for toy brands, and that was very interesting and insightful. In this one particular supply chain mapping that we did, we found that, first of all, the supply chain was extremely complex and deep. In some cases, we saw evidence of workshops or factories being involved in production processes, but couldn't even find an address or name for the factory. So if we can't access it, auditors can't access it. So that leaves a lot to the imagination. But in those factories that we did assess, we found many zero tolerance issues, including child labor, underpayment of minimum wages. We found that dormitories were in the same places or very nearby to the production areas. We also found that people didn't have labor contracts. They were using temporary workers, no training in EHS. They were not equipped to handle chemicals, yet they were doing so. So these are just some of the issues that we found by taking a look into the supply chain. So I think this is just an issue that I would like to highlight, is greater supply chain transparency is quite essential in understanding the hidden risks.
Thanks, Ellen. I think the risk you're probably alluding to are ones that would kick in the further down supply chain tiers you go.
Yes.
So we're obviously not talking about top tier there, but further down. But thanks for that. Just another quick question, pretty for me. How will we be expanding our women's empowerment program beyond China? Yes, we are. So our plan is to take the learnings from India and really now apply a similar approach to other countries that we're operating in, starting with China and then moving from there. So using a similar approach, we're focused on building the kind of skills, capabilities of senior managers and owners at factories. Will be using that approach to drive women's empowerment, hopefully at quite a large scale in China. And again, we'll be sharing more information on that. I know we're nearly at the top of the hour, but I'm just going to one more question, I think probably for you again, Ellen. Some suppliers, particularly those that might have you might have less leverage over as a buyer, may see a child rights intervention as just another expense for them, and therefore being willing to to buy into programs to address those kind of issues. How would you convince them to join? I've got a response to that, but I'll let you answer that in the first instance.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I think the main thing is to highlight the business case. And as you have pointed out in your presentation, this family-friendly spaces and the migrant parenting training has many positive impacts on migrant parent workers and the children and the factories. You explained how it improves the relationship between the satisfaction rates at factories. It can lower increase retention, it can basically increase retention rates, lower costs related to recruitment, and so on and so forth. So when you're approaching suppliers, it's very important, I think, to just highlight really the positive impact and the fact that this isn't just an add-on, a nice thing to have. This is actually a sustainable and innovative tool that shows that allows factories to demonstrate to the workers that yes, they care about them, and at the same time, they are reaping benefits too. So I think we have had some awareness seminars, which have been very important, and I think they've played a crucial role in getting a buy-in. And other things that can be done is arranging, awareness seminars or workshops, basically getting the message out that this is a really impactful program that has long-term benefits.
Thanks, Ellen. And I mean, I think you've covered off most of the points I would there. I think one thing we do see is the more that we connect factories and bring them together to learn from one another and see the benefits that investing in child rights delivers for their business. It's a great way of convincing more and more factories to get on board, and I think the results speak for themselves for factories who participate. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up there. I want to take this opportunity to thank both Ellen and Mateus for their excellent presentations today, but also for all of you for kind of dialing in and listening to us speak today. We hope you found today's webinar useful. As I said, the recording will be sent to you, so do please share that with your colleagues. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, so we'll follow up with those of you who submitted questions we couldn't quite get to on today's webinar. And finally, as part of follow-up, we'll be asking you to share your suggestions for future webinars, so please do so. And in the handout section, you should find further information on the programs we've mentioned today. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you at our next webinar. Thanks a lot.